Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor Daniel Estrada, and this is the lecture video for Lesson 4, Obedience and Conformity. Conformity and Obedience. So this is our theme for this lesson. I want to start not by talking about conformity and obedience, but by talking about workplace rights and responsibilities. There's a segment of your textbook that talks about general expectations and requirements from a workplace environment, expectations of workers in a workplace environment. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to go over some general strategies for conflict resolution. We've seen a couple of instances where engineers have come across conflict, especially with like management, or where they see a problem and then, what do you do about it? So these are just some very general pointers about these issues. Next week we'll talk about whistleblowing and what you should do when you need to break the rules. But this week we're going to talk about what the rules are, what the general expectations are, and also why we tend to follow the rules even when we shouldn't. All right, so this is the point of conformity and obedience. We're going to start the sort of centerpiece of this lesson is this article by Dennis Gioia, Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics. Dennis Gioia was the field recall coordinator for Ford during the Pinto scandal, and it was his responsibility for issuing a recall, but they did not. And in the 90s, he writes this article sort of explaining why he made the decision. He appeals to what he calls script schemas. This is a term in psychology, and so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the social psychology behind conformity, why we tend to follow our social environment, why we tend to follow orders given by authority figures or superiors, and the ethical implications this has. So I want to talk a little bit about Asch's conformity experiment, the Milgram obedience experiment. You might know these experiments, they're rather famous. And then I want to talk a little bit about Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil when talking about Eichmann in Jerusalem. Okay. So there's a lot of just text on these slides, but hopefully it's interesting enough. So this is just from the textbook talking about workplace rights and responsibilities. What are your obligations, in a very general sense, what are your obligations in a professional context? The book says that there's a few virtues of professionalism, such as collegiality. This is like a general respect for your colleagues, your clients, the professional environment, making sure that you're not creating a hostile or unpleasant environment, realizing that everyone is there to work together. Having a commitment to cultivating that team environment, cultivating that professional environment, and also commitment to the specific goals of your project, of your company, the standards and best practices of your field, a general commitment to integrity, this kind of thing. The book mentions connectedness to the broader picture. Why it's important that you're doing what you're doing, the social impact of your project, of your job generally, of your profession, connectedness to a professional community. Being engaged with the professional community, keeping up on standards and so on, keeping in contact with your peers, and cooperation. Working together for mutual benefit, mutual support, being a sort of team player in a professional environment is very important. Right? These are general virtues of working in a professional environment that we should all ideally have some understanding of and some commitments to. Beyond collegiality, the book also talks about things like confidentiality, that you respect proprietary information, patents. Sometimes you have access to trade secrets that you're not allowed to share. Either you're in a contractual obligation, a non-disclosure agreement not to share. Sometimes, just as an engineer, you might come across privileged information that would be unethical to share, even if there's not a strict law against it. And these kinds of issues are also important considerations for workplace rights and responsibilities. Textbook goes into this in more detail. So the textbook also talks about things like respect for authority, and it distinguishes between two kinds of authorities. One, expert authority. Experts have specialized knowledge. Engineering is a kind of expert authority. It's because you've spent a few years in college doing all the math that you have become an expert, and we can appeal to you as an engineer to settle certain sorts of issues or to make a statement on the safety of a bridge or whatever. So there's expert authorities. There's also institutional authorities. Institutional authorities have their authority in virtue of the role they play in a bureaucratic or an administrative system, right? So a manager might have institutional authority even if they don't have expertise. And this is one way that conflicts might arise in a professional environment. We've already seen this in the Challenger explosion, where the managers and the engineers are in a conflict, are in disagreement, and the managers win because they have institutional authority, even though they lack the expertise to understand why their decision was a bad decision. So authorities, in general, control resources and decision-making powers. And there's this question of how do you settle between different kinds of authority, maybe different ranks of authority. Right? The managers themselves might have bosses and higher managers and so on. So authority is also important to understand and respect within a workplace environment. Just understand how it works, how authority works to control power. The book talks about this a little bit too. But then there's also this question of loyalty, which is different from just pure authority. So loyalty has something to do with your, not just commitment, but your bondedness, how tightly you're disposed towards the company. And the book, again, distinguishes between two kinds of loyalty. One it calls agency loyalty, or maybe institutional loyalty. And this is a contractual obligation that you have. When you are employed, you sign a contract, for working a certain amount of time with a certain amount of pay and under certain conditions. And you're obligated to be loyal to that contract, to stay within the bounds of that contract. You have legal obligations to stay within the bounds of that contract. Your employers expect that you do. That's how the institutions work, is that you remain faithful to those contracts. But these contracts are focused on particular actions, what you can and cannot do, what you're owed and not owed in terms of financial support and other kinds of benefits. Right? These actions are independent of anyone's feelings or motivations. Right? So agency loyalty, the fact that you've signed a contract with the company, doesn't require that you like the company or that you have positive feelings about the company. As long as you're fulfilling the terms of your contract, then that's what agency loyalty requires. And the book emphasizes that agency loyalty is only one obligation among many. So yeah, you signed the contract, and that puts an obligation on you to fulfill the terms of that contract. But that obligation might be superseded. It might be overcome by other kinds of obligations. For instance, the obligation to public safety, an obligation to follow the law. The safety one is a big one. Remember, the engineering code of ethics has your paramount concern is the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Paramount means the highest concern, and that means, first of all, it's more important, safety is more important than fulfilling the terms of your contract. If fulfilling the terms of your contract requires that you act in an unsafe manner, then you have an ethical obligation to refuse to fulfill your contract. Now, that might mean that you've broken your contract and are subject to a lawsuit. It might also mean that you've broken the law in some respect. And when the code of ethics, again, when the engineering code of ethics says that the safety, health, and welfare of the public is paramount, that means paramount also over the law. So it might be that some law requires you to do something that you know to be unsafe, or to put the public's health and welfare in an unsafe place. Then in those cases, the code of ethics also requires that you break the law. Breaking a contract, it might be one kind of breaking the law, but maybe there are other kinds of breaking the law. You might think about this in the case of something like, shoving people is wrong, but if someone's about to be hit by a bus, then shoving them out of the way is the right thing to do. Right, so you can violate that law if the health and safety is an issue. Okay. So agency loyalty is contractually obligated. It's a responsibility that you have. It's an obligation, but it's just one obligation among many. It might be superseded for other reasons. But it is an obligation that you should take seriously. But then there's, in contrast to agency loyalty, there's attitude loyalty. And attitude loyalty has to do with your feelings, your positive emotion towards the company. It might be good to have these emotional commitment to the company that you work for. If you've ever worked for a corporation, you might know the company man, the corporate man, who's not just a good employee, but is like really gung-ho about the corporate culture and the corporate attitude, and wears buttons that have the corporate logo on it in their spare time and that kind of stuff. That might be good to be a company man in that way. It might help them do a good job. It might help the people around them stay motivated and so on. It might be a good thing. It might be a virtue, but it's not an obligation. Now, we haven't really talked too much about the ethics of virtues and obligations. We've talked about consequentialism, but consequentialism doesn't really care about virtues or obligations, really. So next week we'll talk more about obligations and deontology, obligations and duties. And then the week after that we'll talk a little bit about virtue ethics. So we'll go into these ideas in a little bit more detail. But hopefully this stuff about professional and workplace environment is fairly straightforward. Now, in this kind of environment, even when everyone's trying to be collegial, there can be all sorts of conflicts that might arise. Conflicts of interest, things like bribes, other kinds of corruption, even things that are less sinister like gifts might cause conflicts of interest. Or even something as normal and everyday as changing jobs. If you change jobs, you might bring with you privileged knowledge from your old job that there might be ethical things to consider about how you can use that knowledge in your new job. We're going to talk more about conflicts of interest in some more detail when we go over the NSP Code of Ethics rigorously in Lesson 7. So I'm just going to put that on the back burner for right now. But we've seen other kinds of conflicts. For instance, the conflicts between expert and institutional authority. We've already talked about this with the Challenger explosion. And also conflicts between agency, loyalty, and other kinds of engineering obligations, right? So the health, safety, welfare of the public. We talked about this also. So the book has a couple of recommendations for creating a ethical workplace where these kinds of collegial, virtues are emphasized and cultivated. And a big part of their recommendations is that you do what you say, especially for management. If management is telling everyone to act ethically, but management is clearly acting unethically, then this kind of hypocrisy tends to make the workers also behave unethically. Right? When you see bad actions in your company, especially from the management, especially from the authority figures, it tends to make the employees think that, well, they don't really care about these rules, or they don't really care about these regulations, and it sort of, the corruption sort of festers and grows. So in order to create an ethical workplace, you have to sort of explicitly acknowledge the ethical practices across not just the employees, but across management also, and that you apply these acknowledgments honestly, that you're taking them seriously, that you're doing what you say, that you're backing up your words with your actions. This has to do with honesty. It also has to do with integrity. And we'll talk a little bit more about integrity in a few weeks, a few lessons. Another really big thing that the book emphasizes is having explicit procedures for conflict resolution, so that when conflicts arise, because they'll inevitably arise, conflicts between people, conflicts between over certain decisions, that there's explicit ways of handling those conflicts that everyone already knows and understands and appreciates, so that when these conflicts arise, you can go through that resolution process without sort of destroying the workplace environment or destroying the the egos and personalities of the people involved, right? The idea is not to avoid conflicts entirely, but to make sure that those conflicts are sort of smooth and they're not jagged and that they tear apart the workplace environment. So that when those conflicts arise, as they always will, that you have procedures for handling them in ways that respect all the parties to the conflict. And this is probably one of the most useful things in the course. The book gives a series of tips, strategies for managing conflict. When you find yourself in a case of conflict, it's very important to separate out the people from the problem. Don't focus on people. When you focus on people, it gets their egos involved. It gets it gets themselves involved emotionally, and that makes it maybe more difficult to work through conflicts, or it makes things more tense and aggravated, right? So not that emotions are bad, but that you want to make sure that the emotions are handled properly, appropriately, and directing those emotions at the problem that's causing the conflict and not the people who are in the conflict. I mean, even if you think it's a person that's a problem, when you're managing the conflict, trying to focus as much on the problem itself as the person themselves can help smooth over the addressing of these conflicts. Right. So focus on problems. Focus on interests and not positions. Right. Don't set up sides that label people or that sort of pigeonhole people in one camp or another, right? Focus on what are the interests at stake and what commitment do we have to those interests, right? Right. Focus on things that will help resolve the conflict. Another really important thing is to generate a variety of possibilities and to make sure that those possibilities are generated by the parties involved to the conflict so that everyone who's in the conflict feels like they're contributing to the resolution. This is very important for having that resolution accepted, is that everyone feels like they're being heard and that the resolution is taking into account their voice and their position, their perspective. Right? If people feel like they're not being heard, even if the solution works out in their favor, if they feel like they're not being heard or if they feel like they're not contributing to that solution, then the possibility for resolutions start to break down. And again, I mentioned this in the last slide, but try to make sure that the procedure that you use to resolve some conflict is based on established rules, some objective criteria. Make sure it's not based on just the preference of people who have authority in the situation or the preference of whoever says. Right? If it's just based on someone's word, then this brings the focus back on people and not on solving the problem. Right? So having neutral, objective standards set up in place ahead of time is very important for helping to resolve these conflicts. Some of this might sound like common sense, but these are sort of tips and tricks that you might want to think about, especially when you get into conflicts, to go back to this list and sort of think about what's going on and how to approach it in a way that reduces the sort of anxiety and emotional stress from everyone involved. Okay, so I want to move on to talk about Dennis Gioia. Dennis Gioia was the field recall coordinator for Ford from 72 to 75. Remember, the Pinto was in use from 71 to 78 or 79. So he was right there in the thick of the Pinto scandal. And in the article, he talks about getting reports back from field coordinators, from the field investigators, with pictures of burned out Pintos and people dead inside, and having to respond to these pictures. He starts his story by talking about how he was an idealist. He talks about being in college and having long hair and being a child of the 60s, he says. He protested the Vietnam War and was an activist for various causes. He thought that he could help change business culture, and he thought he could help change it from the inside. But very quickly he finds out that his sort of activist idealism is replaced with the corporate culture, especially working at some place like Ford, which is very competitive, very high profile, very demanding job. And he very quickly gets sucked into the competitive environment and loses his initial ethical idealism. And so when the Pinto cases start coming up, and he sees these burned out cars, he says he remembers feeling disquieted by the pictures, but that he had to sort of mute his emotions, sort of ignore his emotions, because he says he was following a script. So the attendance word for this lesson is script. You can use that word to get attendance credit for this lesson. So I want to read just a couple of passages from the article. So Gioia says, I remain... So this is him sort of explaining why he wrote this essay. He says that at the time he remained convinced that he made the right decision in not recommending recall of the cars. In light of the times and in light of the evidence available, he says, I thought I had pursued a reasonable course of action. More recently, however, I've come to think that I really should have done everything I could have to get those cars off the road. So he thinks he made the wrong decision at the time. Well, why does he think he made the wrong decision? Well, because he was following a script. That script was set up by Ford. He says, one of these new files concerned reports of Pintos lighting up, in the words of the field representative, in rear-end accidents. He says, but there were actually very few reports, perhaps because component failures were not initially assumed. The cars were simply consumed by fire after apparently very low-speed accidents. Was there a problem? Not as far as I was concerned. My cue for labeling cases as a problem either required high frequency of occurrence or directly traceable causes. I had little time for speculative contemplation on potential problems that did not fit a pattern that suggested known courses of action leading to possible recall. Right, so he had a script. The script says you issue a recall if you have high frequency of occurrence or directly traceable causes. Since there weren't a lot of these Pinto cases and they weren't suspecting a component failure, he didn't think it was a problem. So it didn't fit the script, so he didn't issue a recall. And from his perspective, it was a straightforward decision. Right, there was no question. In fact, they even called a few meetings about the Pinto. They saw these reports coming back, and they're like, well, should we do something? They called a meeting, and it was unanimously voted, I think twice in two different meetings. It was unanimously voted the Pinto did not meet the criteria for a recall, and so they just didn't issue a recall. Now, Gioia tries to explain why he didn't issue a recall. So part of it was that, look, there was a lot of things to do. He says it was an incredibly overwhelming job, the busiest, most information-filled job that I've ever held or would want to hold. He says that in several occasions he confused the facts of one case with another because he was juggling so much. He says he thought of myself as a man who perfectly fit the description by one of my colleagues. In this fire, everything is a crisis. You only have time to put out the big fires and spit on the little ones. By these standards, the Pinto was a distinctly little problem. Right, so it just wasn't enough of a problem for him to do something about, despite the fact that he was disquieted about the burned-out Pintos that he saw in these pictures. And he says it's important to convey the muting of emotion that was involved in the recall coordinator's job. He says, I sometimes woke up at night wondering whether I'd covered all the bases. Had I left some unknown person at risk because I had not thought of something? But that soon faded, however, and of necessity, the consideration of people's lives became fairly removed, dispassionate process. To do the job well, he says, there was little room for emotion. So remember, he goes into the job with this emotional zeal, thinking that he can change the business corporate culture from the inside, and very quickly he ends up quieting his own emotions, ignoring his own feelings about these issues in order to do the job well. Because if you want to advance in the corporate culture, if you want to climb that ladder, right, if you want to get the recognition of your bosses and become successful, then you need to do what you're told, follow the rules, follow the script. Does that mean that Gioia sold out? Well, he says, no, I didn't sell out, but were my cognitive structures altered by salient experience? Without question. Scripts for understanding an action were formed and reformed in a relatively short period of time, in a way that not only altered perceptions of issues, but also likely the actions associated with those altered perceptions. So Dennis Gioia is saying, I didn't sell out my values. Instead, I was just following the scripts, and the scripts changed my brain so that I was making different decisions. Actually, let me just check Urban Dictionary for sellout. A sellout is someone who sacrifices artistic integrity in an effort to become more successful or popular. A sellout abandons their convictions to impress people or become more popular. A sellout is someone who betrays a cause for personal advancement. Gioia wants to say, well, I wasn't really selling out because I was just following the script. So there's a name for this kind of argument. It's called superior orders, or sometimes called the Nuremberg defense. the Nuremberg defense is the idea that I was just following orders. An order is an order. And that you can't blame me for doing something wrong because I was doing what I was being told to do. Right? So if my boss told me to do it, or my commanding officer told me to do it, then it's not really my fault because I was being told to do it. This is the Nuremberg defense. It's called the Nuremberg defense because a bunch of Nazis used this excuse when they were brought up on military trials in the 40s after World War II. They were being accused of war crimes and various things, and they wanted to say, no, it wasn't really our fault because we were just following our orders. So traditionally, the Nuremberg defense doesn't work. It's not considered legitimate for someone to claim that they're not responsible because they were following orders. Right? Merely following orders is not enough to get out of any responsibility. So when this defense comes up, it usually doesn't work. But not that it doesn't work entirely. It is not entirely, just that it's not entirely effective. So, for instance, in the My Lai massacre, which was a massacre in the Vietnam War, where U.S. soldiers went into a village and slaughtered everyone in the village, some 500 or so people, slaughtered everyone in the village, including women and children, innocent villagers, and they did it because they were told to do it by their commanding officer. So after this was found out, and there was a big scandal, and the soldiers who committed the offense were brought to trial, a lot of them were punished, but they weren't punished as severely as the commanding officer, who was punished more severely. So the soldiers who committed the crimes were still punished, but they weren't punished as severely as the commanding officer. So the idea is that if your commanding officer tells you to do something, you're not just supposed to follow orders without thinking about it. As a human being, you have an obligation to think about what you're being told to do and to question it. And if you're being told to do something that you know is wrong, morally wrong, puts people in danger, or is otherwise unethical, then you have an obligation to not follow those orders. Then you have an obligation to refuse to follow unjust orders. And if you follow those orders anyway, then you can be held responsible for it. It doesn't matter that your commanding officer told you. Now, but this is tricky because, if it's your commanding officer, this is a war environment, then maybe you're refusing to follow the order is looked at as treason, and treason can be a capital punishment, and so maybe your life is on the line. And so, right, here's this conflict. Do you go through with an unethical act in order to save your life, or do you go through, or do you refuse to go through the unethical act? Right, these are the kind of conflicts you have to face. So this is what Dennis Gioia is saying. He's saying, look, it wasn't my responsibility because I was just following the script. And, I was really, it was really bad. I sometimes kept me up at night thinking that I was doing, I was being dangerous. Poor Dennis Gioia. So I don't think this is a great excuse. You can talk about how responsible you think Dennis Gioia was for not issuing the recall. Read his essay and see what you think. But this idea of a script is definitely worth talking about and worth understanding pretty closely. So a script is a script schema. Schema is a kind of representation. You have all sorts of representations, theories, and models, and so on, that your brain uses to understand the world. A script is one of these things you use to understand the world and also to act in the world. A script describes certain expected and appropriate behavior when you interact in a certain kind of social situation. A classic example of a script is something like when you order a fast food at a restaurant, or at a counter, or at a table. How you talk to your waiter. The script of standing in line. What it means to stand in line. When you can move ahead and when it counts as someone who's left the line. That cutting is not allowed. These kinds of things. These are all scripts in the sense that they describe what's allowed and not allowed. What you're supposed to do in certain situations. How you're supposed to behave. Ordering food is a really easy one because there's certain things you do when you're ordering food. The cashier says, "Can I take your order?" And then you give the order, and then you exchange money, and it happens in that particular fashion, right? You're not supposed to give the money first and then make your order. That would be the wrong way of doing it. That would be weird if you just handed money over without telling them what you wanted. Right, so you're supposed to do that in a specific order, and if you step out of that order, then things get weird. Then you don't know what to expect or what to anticipate, and so it becomes difficult to negotiate the situation. Right, if you go up to your cashier and they say, "Can I take your order?" and you start, talking about what they're wearing and asking where they live and this kind of stuff, this is very inappropriate behavior. This is way off script, and so this is something that is it's creepy. It's creepy. Partly because it's so outside of our expectations of what's appropriate in that situation. Right, so staying within the bounds of these appropriate behaviors, being able to follow the script, it's partly what allows us to interact with complete strangers, right? I don't have to know the cashier, I don't have to know anything about their history or who they are or whether they're a trustworthy person. The reason I can still nevertheless engage them, very sort of elaborate, several-step process, is because we both know the script. And the fact that we both know the script is part of what establishes the trust between us. And so if you deviate from that script, then that trust is broken, and so the situation becomes weird. So following these kinds of scripts is absolutely essential for being able to negotiate complex social situations. But it also lets us do something like run on autopilot. And this is what Dennis Gioia says when he's making the decisions, when he's following the script, he's running on autopilot. Look, I don't have to think about whether I should issue a recall on the Ford Pinto because the script tells me that I don't have to. So because there's this simple rule to follow, all I have to do is follow the rule without thinking about what rule I'm following, or whether it's the right rule to follow, or whether this is the appropriate situation to follow the rule, or whether this might be a situation where we have to break the rule. Right? Because you have the rule at all, you can sort of go on autopilot and not think about it. And so maybe you want to connect this to the David Foster Wallace This Is Water video, where he's talking about the natural default setting, where we act according to the sort of script that we're the center of the world, and that everything's about us, everything revolves around us, and this sort of lets us act on autopilot without thinking too carefully about what we're doing or what impact it has on the people around us. Right, so think a little bit about how scripts inform our behavior. Think also about how much control we have in following or breaking scripts. And this is sort of what I want to talk about next. I've got these pretty great videos. This video is the elevator conformity experiment. I'll let you go ahead and watch it on your own, but it's the people standing in the elevator facing the other way around. You're not supposed to face the back of the elevator. That's not the convention. But if you put someone in an elevator where they are standing facing the other way, they'll pretty soon turn around. So this is a clip from an old Candid Camera episode from back in the 50s or whatever. Prudential bought the clip and uses it as a commercial, but this isn't a Prudential commercial. This isn't a Prudential video. This is a Candid Camera video. So you can watch that. It's an old and very classic clip. There's a modern variation of this that you might have seen wandering around social media. In this situation, there's this waiting room, and there's a buzz that goes off, and every time the buzz goes off, everyone in the waiting room stands up. So all of these people are actors, and they're deliberately standing up when the buzz goes off, and the idea is that they're trying to get her to conform. So the girl in the purple, she's supposed to stand up. They're trying to make her conform by everyone else is doing the thing, and so eventually she stands up also. Right, so this is an example of conformity. Let me sort of fast forward a little bit here. And what's interesting is that she conforms even after everyone moves away. So eventually all the people get called in and she's by herself, but then the buzz goes off again. And when it does, she stands up. I just missed it. Yeah, she stands up. Even though there's no one around to enforce the... So this is an example of conformity. It's an example of conformity because no one's telling her to do this. There's no authority figure demanding that she do this. She's merely just following her peers. Right? So this kind of peer pressure is an example of conformity. And the great thing about this video is that once she's learned how to do it, even though she doesn't know why she's doing it, there's no explanation for why she's doing it, but she's just been socially trained to do it. And now you put new people in and... yeah, she says everyone was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to. And because she thought she was supposed to, now the new person thinks that he's supposed to also. And you can sort of pass this learned trait down the generations. every human tradition, culture, ritual, belief, practice that we have is learned in exactly this way. Right? We find ourselves in a situation where a bunch of people are doing a thing, and we pick up that practice pretty easily and then pass it along ourselves. Again, this is absolutely central to our capacity as human beings to pass along our knowledge across the generations, our capacity to learn very quickly from our social environment, to replicate and imitate the people around us, even when we don't fully understand what we're doing. Right? This is absolutely central to human social intelligence. So I'm not knocking conformity. It's very important that we're able to do this. But because we conform, that means it's pretty easy to get us to conform in bad ways. So a lot of these experiments come out of this 1951 Solomon Asch conformity experiment. In this experiment, and there's a video here to show you how it works, but in this experiment, you're asked to say of this, so here's this line, and then of these three lines, which line is the same size as this line? So it's pretty easy to see, if your vision is okay, that it's line C is the same length as this line, and that A is shorter and B is long. And people are, if they have good vision, they're able to get this problem right pretty easily. It's just a perception problem. But if you put that person in a room with a bunch of other people who are actors, they're confederates of the experiment, and they deliberately give the wrong answer, they deliberately say A instead of C, then you can get the subject of the experiment, the person that you're testing, you can get them to give the wrong answer also about 37% of the time. So when you do these experiments, about 37% of the time, someone's going to give the wrong answer and conform with the crowd. 75% of the people studied in the original experiments give at least one wrong answer. Only 25% of the people stubbornly never conform to the crowd. So 75%, right, the overwhelming majority give at least one wrong answer, and about 30% you'll get a wrong answer. Very few conform all the time, only 5%. But most people, 75%, conform sometimes. And right, it's weird. It's this little perceptual thing. You might think that what the code says shouldn't influence what length of line you see, but in fact, it makes people doubt themselves. There's several different reasons why they give the wrong answer. Sometimes they doubt their own perception. Maybe I'm seeing it wrong. If everyone else is giving a different answer, then maybe there's something wrong with my eyes or my vision. But there's also people who just don't want to make waves. They don't want to cause a disruption. If they give the different answer, then people might look at them funny, and they don't want to be, they don't want to stand out from the crowd. Right? So this kind of social pressure makes people conform. You can make people not conform. One way of making people not conform is by having a secret ballot. Right? If everyone else is saying their answers out loud, but you tell the subject to write their answers down on paper, because no one else sees their answer, then they're less likely to conform. But if you have them say it out loud in front of the crowd, then they're more likely to conform. This is why secret ballots are really important. Right? If you have to give a vote where everyone can see what vote you make, then you're very likely to give a vote to conform to the crowd. But if you give a vote anonymously, then you're more likely to give your honest answer. Another thing you can do in order to make people not conform is to put someone on your side, right? So if you have 5 people who are Confederates, and 4 of those people give the wrong answer, but one of those people gives the right answer, then the person that you're studying, the subject, is also more likely to give the right answer, as long as one of those people is on their side. Not only are they more likely to give the right answer, but they're also more likely to express positive feelings towards the person who gave the right answer. They don't think that the person who gave the right answer had any influence over their own answer. They think that they gave their own answer because they saw it on the card. But because the person gave the same answer as them, they tend to have positive feelings towards that person. This is why it's important to speak up. If you see something wrong, sometimes it's the case that when you see something wrong, no one says anything because they think someone else is going to say something, or if no one else is saying something, then maybe it's not that wrong, or they might doubt themselves. But as soon as someone speaks up, it's very likely that a whole bunch of other people speak up. We're seeing this with the Me Too campaign online. Abuse and harassment that women face. It's very pervasive. It happens all over the place. But for a long time, people just didn't talk about it very much. But then the sort of floodgates open, and then once some people talked about it, then a lot of other people felt very comfortable talking about it. And this is something that you see from these conformity experiments, that people are more likely to speak up and tell the truth when they see that other people are on their side, that other people are doing the same thing. Right? This is why it's very important to speak up when you see something wrong, because other people probably see the same thing and you're just not saying it. So when you say it, it might open up floodgates. So Asch conformity experiment is fun. 37% of the time you're getting incorrect answers, remember. But the real beautiful experiment here is the Milgram obedience experiment. So this is obedience, not conformity. Obedience is characterized by having an authority figure. Conformity is you conform to your peers, but obedience is you're obedient to authority. So the Milgram obedience experiment, you might know about it, is the shock experiment. Right? The idea is there's an experimenter, there's a teacher, and there's a learner. And the teacher is supposed to be administering shocks to the learner in order to get them to learn a word list. So the setup is that the teacher is told that the goal of the experiment is for the learner to memorize the list, and the experiment is to test whether administering electric shocks helps people learn helps people memorize the list. But that's not the real experiment, and in fact, no one gets shocked in the Milgram experiment. The real experiment is to see how many electric shocks the teacher's willing to give. So the way the experiment is set up is that the learner says something about having a heart condition and that they shouldn't be under stress. And then once the shocks start being administered, the learner starts screaming in pain, saying, "Ow, it hurts, get me out of here, I want the experiment to stop the experiment, it can't go on, my heart's starting to hurt." Eventually the learner stops giving an answer altogether, right? It's sort of screaming in pain, and then just falls silent. So they might be passed out, they might be dead, you don't know. But the teacher is told by the experimenter, you must keep going, keep administering the shocks, please continue, it's absolutely essential that you go on. You have no choice but to go on. And the question that the experiment is designed to test is how far is the teacher willing to go? Remember that no one's actually getting shocked, but the teacher believes that they're shocking someone. And the question is, how many shocks is the teacher willing to give? Now, when Milgram proposed this experiment, he handed out a survey to the psychology students at Yale, where he was doing the experiment. And he asked the senior psychology students, how far do you think people will go? And the guess was less than 10% will give the final shock. I think it was less than 1/10 of 1%, I think, is the actual answer. It was like 0.03% of the people, it was determined, would go through to the final shock. Because after all, in the lead up to that final shock, the other person's screaming in pain, saying, "Hey, stop, get me out of here, get me out of here." So most people thought that the teacher would just give up around then. But in fact, that's not what happened. In fact, 65% of the people in the original experiment, 65% of the people go through to the very final shock, past the point where they think the person is dead, and continue administering the shocks as long as they're getting prodded by the experimenter. Only 35% of the people refuse to give that final shock, stop at some point before then. 65% of the people. Remember, for the conformity experiments, only 37% of the people conform to the crowd in that perceptual experiment. I mean, no one's even getting hurt in that experiment, and only 35% of the people conform. But in this case, in the Milgram experiment, the people are under the impression that they're giving potentially fatal electric shocks to a person, and they're willing to follow along with that shock all the way to the very end. I love this experiment. Let me go ahead and show you some of this. So here's an example of someone who refuses.
15 volts for the first wrong answer. Okay. Do not begin until I say ready, begin, please. Yelling in there.
Actually, let me go up here.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts. Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
To complete the test. Please continue.
I sure don't know the effect of this thing, and I'm a little skeptical about electricity.
The experiment requires that you go on, teacher. Please continue.
Incorrect. 150 volts.
Oh,
Sad face.
experimenter. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue.
My heart's starting to
Continue,
bother me.
teacher.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
I think we ought to find out what's wrong in there first.
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Well, the experiment might require that we continue, but I still think we should find out what the condition of the gentleman is.
Now, as I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not dangerous.
Look, I don't know anything about electricity. I don't profess any knowledge, nor will I go any further until I find out if the guy's okay.
It's absolutely essential that you continue.
Well, essential or not, this program isn't quite that important to me that I should go along doing something that I know nothing about, particularly if it's going to injure someone. I don't know what this is all about.
Well, whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs correctly.
Well, you can sure have your $4.50 back. I didn't want it anyhow. I intend to give it to some charitable organization, but I wouldn't go on with it.
The 450 is not the issue here. That check is yours simply
Yeah, I
to come
realize
to the
that.
lab. It is essential that you continue the experiment.
No, it isn't essential. Not one bit.
You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Okay,
Teacher
so this
was
is a
of
guy
necessity.
who, yes, this is a guy who refused to go on, and you heard the prodding from the experimenter. So he goes, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue." It's absolutely essential that you continue, and if the person keeps objecting, then they say you have no other choice. You must go on. One of the interesting things about the Milgram experiment is that if you ever got to this last prod, if you ever told the person that you have no choice, you must go on, that's exactly when they said, no, I do have a choice, and I'm not going to go on. Anyone who you got to this final claim to, anyone that the experimenter said, you have no choice, you must go on, every single one of those people refused to go on. But if it never got that far, then the teacher just kept giving prods all the way to the very end. So right now it's showing this is another person who
It's absolutely
refuses to go
essential that you
on.
continue.
Well, he don't want to. I refuse to.
Well, you have no other choice. You must
Yes,
go
I
on.
have a choice.
That is, if you don't continue, we're going to have to discontinue the experiment.
We'll have to. He says cut it out. After all, he knows what he can stand. Right, I took that thing, the slight one. It was enough for me. I wouldn't want to be getting that every time I got a wrong answer.
All right, so this is another guy who refuses to go along with the thing. Now let me show you this guy. This guy in the white shirt. Oh, this guy.
Answer.
Okay, here we go.
Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, force.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue,
My
please.
heart's
Go right
starting to
on.
bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue. The next word is sad.
Want me to keep going?
Continue, please.
Oh, sad. Sad. Face, music, clown, girl. Short.
Fast
Sentence, movie, skirt, time. Answer, please.
Let me out.
That guy's hollering in there.
Continue, please. Go on.
There's a lot of them here, you know. They have a heart condition there. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Ow. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
Can't
here.
stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, there. You hear him hollering? He's
As I said
crying.
before, the shocks may be painful, but
Yeah,
they're not
but he's in there
dangerous.
hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there.
You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I
pairs.
refuse to take the responsibility. I'm getting hurt in there. I'm not, he's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. Who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. Answer, please. Wrong. 195 volts. Dance.
Oh. Let me out of here. Let me out of here.
Continue,
My heart's
please.
bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out.
Let
me out of here. Let me out. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out. Let me out.
So, I strongly recommend you watch this video. It's absolutely fascinating. You can tell this guy, he doesn't want to hurt the guy. He very clearly doesn't want to hurt the guy, and he's completely agitated here. His head is in his hands. He's moving around. He's breathing heavy. You can tell that he's not comfortable with what he's doing. This isn't a case of him wanting to do to hurt this man. He's not malicious. He has no ill intentions towards this man. In fact, he almost looks like he very much wants to stop doing this. He doesn't want to be doing this. But there's an experimenter right there telling him, you must go on, please go on. And that's enough. Having that experimenter there is enough to get him to continue shocking the person even after he's uncomfortable with it, even after he's gone past his own point of moral comfort. He doesn't want to do it, but the expert says that he's taking responsibility, right? He's the authority figure, he's taking responsibility. And responsibility, then this guy's going to keep going on with it. And you'll hear, if you keep on watching it, it goes past the point where the guy sounds like he's dead. And then the experimenter says, start from the beginning and keep going through. And he keeps doing it all the way through. They don't like running the Milgram experiments anymore because it's so traumatic to the teacher. It's like it makes them very agitated. It makes them very anxious. So they don't like running the Milgram experiment. But it has been run a few times after this, and the results are robust. It turns out that 65% of people are willing to go far past their own point of moral comfort if an authority figure is telling them to do it. As long as there's a convincing authority figure, right? The authority figure here is a scientist from Yale, right? In a lab coat, looks very professional. And if it looks like he's a professional person in charge, he's at Yale, it's a big, important institution, shouldn't we listen to him? Right? This is also, in the 60s, during the space race and the Cold War, contributing to science, to our scientific knowledge is a patriotic duty. So you have some obligation to listen to, even when you're uncomfortable with what you're doing, maybe you have some duty to follow these orders. Right, people are willing to be obedient. Again, there's ways of making people less obedient. One thing is if the authority figure doesn't look like an authority figure, if they're not dressed the way that you'd expect an authority figure to be dressed, or if they're not talking the way that you expect an authority figure to be talking, then people are just less likely to listen to them. Or if they're dressed in board shorts and or whatever, then people are less likely to listen to them. If there are multiple authorities and the authorities disagree with each other, right? If there's one of the experimenters are saying, please go on, and the other experimentor is like, I don't know, maybe we should stop, then people stop being obedient, right? So in order to get people to be obedient to authority, especially if it's authority that they're not comfortable with, it has to be a unified block of authority. There can't be any disagreement among the authority figures handing down these rules. Right, so authority matters. Again, autonomy matters. If you tell people that they have no choice, this is where they assert their choice. Right. So the question is, do you administer the shock or not? I strongly suggest you watch the video, that you read a little bit about the experiment. It's very interesting. Please don't talk about the Stanford prison experiment. Stanford prison experiment is bad science. There's very little interesting science that comes out of it. It's a cultural event that happened, but there's almost nothing of scientific relevance that happened in Stanford Prison Experiment. And that's in contrast to the Milgram obedience experiment, which is quite interesting and important here. So the last thing I want to talk about is the obedience experiment occurred partly because Milgram was watching the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, and Hannah Arendt, a philosopher at Columbia, was writing about the Eichmann trial. So Eichmann was an SS officer, a Nazi officer in World War II. He was in charge of a lot of the management of the Holocaust, the killing of 8 million Jews, and lots of other people. Eichmann wasn't the person who was putting gas in the showers. He wasn't the person who was actually pulling triggers and killing people, but he was the desk manager who designed a lot of the infrastructure. He coordinated a lot of it. He was a bureaucrat in charge of a lot of this activity. And after the war was over, Eichmann gets taken to Jerusalem and put on trial for war crimes. And Hannah Arendt is a Jewish philosopher who escaped Germany during the war and came to New York and worked at Columbia, had a position teaching philosophy at Columbia, and she was asked by the New Yorker to go down to Jerusalem and cover the trial. She does this in a series of articles called Eichmann in Jerusalem. She publishes this in a book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she gives it the subtitle, Report on the Banality of Evil. The Banality of Evil. Banal means like ordinary, plain, commonplace. The point here is about unquestionably Eichmann did evil things. He had a leadership role in the slaughtering of millions of people. He did a terrible thing. But Hannah Arendt in the trial says that Eichmann doesn't look like a monster, he looks more like a clown. She writes, I'll go ahead and read the passage. I was struck by a manifest shallowness in the doer that made it impossible to trace the incontestable evilness of his deeds to any deeper level of roots or motives. The deeds were monstrous, but the doer, at least the very effective one now on trial, was quite ordinary, commonplace, and neither demonic nor monstrous. There was no sign in him of any firm ideological convictions or specific evil motives, and the only notable characteristic one could detect in his past behaviors, as well as in his behavior during the trial and throughout the pretrial police examination, was something entirely negative. It was not stupidity, but thoughtlessness. Thoughtlessness, maybe, I again refer you back to the David Foster Wallace natural default setting. She talks about how he was hapless, and his cliché-ridden language produced on the stand, as it had evidently done in his real life, a kind of macabre comedy. Cliché stock phrases, adherence to conventional, standardized codes of expression and conduct, have the socially recognized function of protecting us against reality. That is, against the claim that our thinking attention, the claim on our thinking attention that all events and facts make by virtue of their existence. If we were responsive to this claim at all. If we were responsive to this claim all the time, we would be exhausted. Eichmann differed from the rest of us only in that he knew of no such claim at all. Right, so the idea was that Eichmann was thoughtlessness. Eichmann appealed to the Nuremberg defense. He says, look, I was just following orders. And he says, I thought the thing that I was supposed to do was follow orders. I thought I was doing the right thing. Eichmann thought he was doing the right thing because, look, he was getting praised for doing what he was doing. It was because he was doing what he was doing, it's because he was following orders, that he had the prestigious position that he did in the Nazi regime, right? He was successful by the standards of that community, and so he thought he was doing the right thing. And when he was on trial, he thought, look, I was following orders, that's what I thought it was expected of me, I didn't know that I should have done something else. And this is what Hannah Arendt is accusing him of. This is not monstrous evilness, this is thoughtlessness. This is him not recognizing that there was an obligation on him to think more about what he was doing. Right? So Hannah Arendt talks about this in terms of the banality of evil, and right, the point is just that we have this idea of evil as being the sort of comic book evil, the sort of Mr. Burns in his mansion with his fingers steepled, petting a cat or whatever, lightning bolts behind him going off. Right? That evil is the result of evil, like deeply evil men with incredibly evil intentions who wreak their evil on the world. And Hannah Arendt's point is that no, evil is far more insidious than this. Evil is really the product not of... I mean, there are maybe incredibly wicked men who do incredibly evil things out of no justification, but maybe most of the evil that happens is not the result of incredible wickedness, but instead is a result just of thoughtlessness. Right? You might think that the world is a bad place because people are greedy or because people are bad or selfish or whatever. But maybe one of the reasons why things are so bad is because people just don't think about what they're doing. People fail to have the right perspective on what they're doing, and so they end up causing great harms, not because they want those harms to happen, but because they're not thinking enough to prevent them from happening. And one of the reasons this is scary, right, this idea of the banality of evil, one of the reasons it's scary is because it means that any of us could be so evil as Eichmann. Right? If we're put in a situation where the reward structure encourages us to follow those rules, then maybe we end up doing incredibly evil things. Not because we want to do evil things, but because we're in systems that encourage us to do evil things, and we're just not thinking sharply enough to prevent it from happening. Right? Eichmann kills millions of people because he's not thinking about what he's doing. Maybe Gioia kills hundreds of people. Dennis Gioia kills a few hundred people because he doesn't, because he's deliberately putting his thoughts aside, putting his emotional responses aside in order to do his job well and get the recognition from within the corporate culture that he's after. Right? And maybe this is what causes the world to be as miserable as it is. So hopefully you can think a little bit stronger for yourself. I want to stop the thread by playing the first follower video. I think I'm just going to play it in here.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is over-glorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
Yeah, so, one more time. Following isn't bad. Following can be a great thing. But understand what you're doing when you're following. Understand how conformity works. Thank you. I will see you all next week. Bye.